and welcome. We are talking today about how we launched a brand new design system with zero downtime. If you would like to follow along with the slides, we do have some sample code throughout. You can go to bit.ly VueConf-2020, and then you can follow along with the slides there. But first, I would like to introduce to you Sean, my colleague. He's an engineer at Thinkful, and he is the winner of third place beard in the under 4-inch category at the Michigan Irish Music Festival.
One of my proudest moments. Cecy is also an engineer at Thinkful. Not only that, but she is, as you can see, a donut enthusiast, and she's a local Austinite. Her foodie recommendations have kept us afloat during this conference. I'll say that much. All right. So VueConf, we have for you today an agenda for our case study that we'll be presenting for y'all. I can now legally say y'all since we're in Texas. First, we'll be talking about the pre-launch phase of our new design system, mainly defining an MVP. Then we'll talk about our success criteria. How did we define that? Who did we define it with? Next, we'll go into how Vue specifically helped us out in this project, along with how Nuxt.js helped us out. Then I'll be handing things off to Cecy to talk about our continuous QA process, how we involved stakeholders throughout the entire timeline, and how we kept things efficient and non-blocking throughout. Then we'll talk about our post-launch reflections. Was the project successful, basically, going back to those success criteria. And then Cecy is going to talk about our next steps and what is still going on today with the kind of tail end of the project. First, let's take a look at thinkful.com before the launch of our new design system. So here's our splash page. As you can see, we have desktop styles. We have the tablet and mobile views there. Thinkful, for a little bit of a primer, we're an online technical school. Until very recently, we were pretty much a coding boot camp, very focused on front-end engineering courses. But due to the change in our curriculum focus, we opted to move to a new design system to reflect that. You see, a lot of the feedback we were getting from user testing on our old design system was that it was a little monotonous, a little monochromatic, as you can see, mostly black and white, and mainly that the typography and the overall style of the site mostly evoked code. Since we were going to be launching some new courses that weren't programming-centric, we wanted to breathe some new life into our site, and also to launch the design system at the same time as all of our other marketing and promotional material. So here's a glance at some of our course pages. As you can see, again, pretty much looks just like thinkful.com. There's not much to differentiate it, still that black and white kind of code-looking feel. So we needed to add some color and some distinguishing features for each style of course that we offered. Let's take a look at how things panned out after the launch of the new design system. As you can see, thinkful.com, our new splash page, is a little bit more bright, colorful, lively. It has some new illustrations that evoke like fun and cool and studying, but in a fun and cool way. And it doesn't really evoke code so much as like a cool techie vibe. As you can see, our course pages followed up on that and really doubled down. You see, we were asked to kind of color code each course styling. So as you can see, our data science immersion pages are blue. Cecy will be showing off some of the other course pages later, and she'll also be going into how exactly we solved this color coding issue using some reusable Vue techniques later on. So let's get into pre-launch. How do we define our MVP? So we had a very tight schedule, which I'm sure we as developers are really familiar with. We had just over a month, so we really couldn't waste a lot of time. We ended up prioritizing different tasks based on both site traffic, so our user needs, and then also our own future needs, things that would accelerate us while we're working on this project. So we started off first by building out and setting up some tools, feature flags, less mix-ins and variables that could be used across the site, Netlify, which Cecy will talk about more in depth later on, We jumped into some reusable components during those first couple of weeks of the project so that as we scaled, we'd be able to use those to build the actual pages themselves. So Vue was a huge help when it came to that. Then we launched into getting all of our home pages sorted out. So these would be any pages like our splash page or course page we just showed you that is going to be linked to from our marketing efforts that a user might land on. We want them to all have a consistent look and feel, so if someone clicks on our Instagram ad and it takes them to the website, the ad and the website have the same look and feel. It doesn't have that kind of janky inconsistency. And then finally, anything that a user might interact with, such as forms, newsletter sign up, surveys, et cetera. We wanted that to have the new look and feel and have that kind of same flair. And we deprioritized stuff that the user probably wouldn't click to from a marketing page and did that after the initial launch of the design system. So how did we do that exactly? So our design team actually designed the entire website using a tool called Zeppelin. If you're a front-end engineer or a designer, you may be familiar with that. So they laid out the entire site in Zeppelin initially, and we went through each feature in each Zeppelin and broke it into a card. We estimated how many days each card would take, kind of similar to like a loose agile approach. We simplified or chopped in half any card taking more than about 2 days, and then we ordered them by the priority that we talked about. As we were planning, we went through a spreadsheet similar to this, and we spent developer days on cards until we reached our release week. Once we hit that last week, anything that was left remaining either had to be descoped or we had to find some way to add more developers to the team. We were kind of hit with a conundrum because the first couple of weeks of the project, it was really just Cecy and I as engineers. As things went on, it became clear that we would need to add more developers, so we added the wonderful Nikki Brown, who's here with us today. Let's hear it for Nikki. And we also added, a variety of other engineers, and we had a bunch of people making commits on the site towards the end because we really wanted to get everything done and really nail this release. But this kind of gave us an idea of how we could ramp that up as the weeks went on. And Vue was a huge help with that as well, as we'll get into. So how did we establish our success metrics? First, we had to meet our marketing release deadline. There was already so much wrapped up into this marketing release that we really had no choice but to launch it the same week. We could not launch it later, and there was no feasible way for us to launch it earlier. So we had to hit that deadline pretty much on the nose. We also couldn't risk any interruptions to the existing site. So we couldn't have any outages for our users. We couldn't have any bugs introduced to the new site as we were developing the new design system. And then finally, we also couldn't risk any dips in performance or engagement after the site was launched. We wanted it to be a smooth transition for all of our users. So we managed to hit our marketing release deadline exactly on the day of. We also had no outages for our existing site, which we were all pretty happy about. That's always a risk. And finally, we had no dips in performance or in user engagement post-launch. So we hit 3 out of 3, and our stack helped us out with that a lot. So here's how Vue helped us out. First off, as we all know, Vue has reusable components. Like I mentioned before, Cecy and I kind of started off building the foundation of the project. And after those first couple of weeks, we'd built out all of these reusable components that other developers, as they came on, were able to pick up and use to piece together the rest of the pages. So we basically implemented our design system in a component style, and that helped us out a lot. Scope styling was a huge help with that as well. We were able to use mix-ins without stepping on each other's feet and having to, say, pick up something like BEM that some of us weren't familiar with, or other techniques to avoid that with non-scoped styling. Our developers also had prior knowledge. Cecy had worked on the prior design system for the site using Vue. I had worked on projects in previous jobs with Vue. Nikki had experience with Vue, and so on. Like I said, it also worked well with less, which we had committed to use for our style guide across all of our projects. And finally, love it or hate it, it played nice with standard JS right out of the box. So we could just write code and review PRs without really having to worry too much about things like linting, code style, and basically manually linting each other's PRs. Standard JS did that for us as we went along. That way we could focus on semantics over style. One small con is that a lot of our other front-end projects use React. Fortunately, because we were building out a whole new look and feel, this didn't matter quite as much. It may be something that comes up down the road as we implement the new design system in our other projects. All right, so with Vue, we also used Nuxt.js. Nuxt helped us ensure that we were shipping a performant web app, and it also handled routing for us. In addition to that, we were already using Nuxt's SEO-friendly features as described by Alexander in an earlier talk. So we had all of that kind of out of the box done for us. We didn't have to be experts in that to build this new site. That said, we did run into some differences between Nuxt and standard Vue that required workarounds, such as the no SSR tag to fix some small rendering glitches. On top of that, using Docker and Nuxt at the same time made some of our laptops sound like a plane that was about to take off. So there was some minor nuisance there during development, but we didn't run into any issues in prod while using that. Oh. All right, so we were faced with another choice prior to our launch. We were asked to decide between using feature flags or feature branches, like a long-running development branch. We opted for feature flagging for a few reasons. Mainly, we wanted to be able to test our changes in an environment as close to production as possible. Not only did we want to test those changes in a prod environment, we wanted our designers to see them in prod, and we wanted stakeholders to see them in prod also. With a feature branch, there was a risk of the development environment, such as Netlify or our own personal computers that were almost exploding due to Docker and so on, not exactly matching our prod environment, and then being more of a risk on the release day. The risk of feature flagging, on the other hand, is that we may accidentally make some changes to the actual production site. That did happen in some small ways, like changing fonts, but not anything that users really noticed. So that's just something to be aware of when choosing between these two tracks. However, feature flagging did make for an extremely smooth release day, which we'll get to in a little bit. How do we implement feature flags? Well, we took Eric Elliott's feature toggle library, which is just a vanilla JS, full-featured feature flag suite. We wrapped it in a Vue plugin and basically just exposed its API to the Vue instance. It had everything we needed. It could be used in JavaScript. It could be used in our style sheets. It allowed for us to programmatically activate feature flags or to use query parameters to activate them. So one thing that we could do that we used throughout the project was hiding elements that were part of the new design system, not in the old design system, behind a vif using a feature flag. We tied this feature flag to a data property of the same name that we defaulted to false. While we initialized flags programmatically, we had to initialize any of those flags in the before create hook of our top level layout component. That's so that they could be available to any child components in the Nuxt app, in their mounted hooks. So shout out to Jamie for explaining that a little more in depth earlier. That was super helpful. And also, it took a little bit of fumbling for us to figure this out exactly. In the mounted hook of the parent component, or any child components, we then would use the feature toggle plugin to detect whether the feature flag was active or not, and set the data property to true or false based on that. On top of all of that, the library's query parameter feature allowed us to basically make a URL with all of the feature flags that we wanted to show off to our stakeholders, and then send that URL to our stakeholders who could then test it in production without even really having to know what a feature flag was or enter anything into the console or do any other kind of finagling. As I said, we could also use the feature flags in our styles. And thanks to Les's nesting feature, we were able to do that in a way that kept both design systems' styles very close to each other and made for a pretty easy cleanup phase, relatively speaking. Every single feature flag that was activated would actually get added to the body element. And so we could then just wrap the class of whatever component we were trying to change the styling of for our new design system in the feature flag using an ampersand, which means like the parent selector in less, and then change the color of something, change the font of something, and users would be none the wiser unless they were our test users who were using the feature flag. On top of that, and most importantly, our feature flag system allowed for a really smooth release day that was pretty much a single PR, and that helped us avoid any kind of risky, massive merge of any sort, or any other kind of like source control related switcheroo that might be prone to blowing up the entire site for a day. Nuxt.js enabled a big part of this, since we were able to use its config file to set all the feature flag classes on the body on launch day, similar to how the feature toggle library did. So we just added a single string to our config file, and we were good to go. We also ended up initializing the release feature flags in JavaScript using the before create trick mentioned earlier by just putting all of those flag names into an array. So we basically had a maybe 50-line PR on launch day. We all reviewed, we all tested it, and then we flipped a switch, and we were able to ship it. So once we shipped it, we got to spend the day testing and buckled up for a little bit of feature flag cleanup. Now, I mentioned previously that we had some interesting challenges to solve based on the specs for our new design system. And we also had some loose ends to be tied up a little bit after our release. So now I'm going to be handing things over to Cecy to talk about how we leverage Vue and Nuxt.js in order to solve those problems.
Thank you, Sean. So I'm going to talk to you about how we specifically solved a use case that we had with CSS variables. So from the previous design that Sean showed, we had a requirement that each course page needed to have a different course color associated with it. So for example, data science has a data science teal color, data analytics has a data analytics green in color, product design has a purple color. So we had a need to be able to pass a color variable from a parent component, which would be the course page, to its children. And we found that CSS variables was a great way to do this. So first we started by setting a, we would pass the course color from the parent component to the children that needed that prop. And then within our JavaScript, we had a computed property called CSS props, which was an object that would use the CSS variable notation, so that's -- course color, and then we would set that to this course color prop that was being passed down. So once we have that object, set that CSS variable, we would pass that into the template using vbind style, passing in those CSS props. So essentially what this was doing is setting the CSS variables to that parent sort of div within that component. And then after that, once we set it, that variable becomes available to any children classes or elements that might need it within this component by just using var course color, which is how you use a variable with the CSS variables. So this made it very easy because once you set it on that parent div of a component, all of that value cascades down. So CSS variables, when I first was looking into it for this project, I thought we might not be able to use them, but really if you look at can I use, it is quite supported. The only holdouts being Internet Explorer and Opera Mini. So at that point, we looked at our Google Analytics and saw what percentage of traffic this comprised of. And we saw that Internet Explorer was maybe like less than 1%. So we were okay with that trade-off. But that's something that you should take into consideration. And then this was the end product. As I was mentioning before, we would have different course colors. And it wasn't just a background element. You could use this for hovers and for other types of interactions as well in your CSS. Next, I wanted to talk about our continuous QA process that we use throughout. This was like a really cool process that we've implemented on our day-to-day. Essentially, we use Netlify as a staging server. So every time that we push a new branch, Netlify creates a preview branch. This URL usually changes. It'll be like something preview -- and the number of your pull requests or something like that. So it's a URL that changes a lot. So we use this in our dev and design cycle of reviews because our designer was a lot more used to reviewing these types of URLs. But these URLs can get a little bit clunky to share with stakeholders because they might look at a different preview branch or something like that. So for circulating the design with stakeholders, as Sean mentioned, we used a magic parameter that would turn off our feature flags on and off. And then this way, stakeholders essentially could bookmark that and then check on the status of the redesign project at any time. And this really decoupled the feedback cycle that we would get from stakeholders. So we would work very closely with design and to get their feedback. But then once we needed stakeholder feedback, they knew that they could check the site at any time with that param. And then this way, they were able to provide feedback in a way that was not blocking our development. So did we achieve our goal of launching on time, no downtime, and performance site sort of like boost? I would say yes, yes, and yes. So what are we up to now? One of the things that we had to do is embark on a post-launch cleanup and clean up any feature flagging code and get rid of any feature flags in the CSS. But this also allowed us to focus on things like web perf, because the cleanup phase after something like a relaunch is, I think, a great time to start looking at your site a little bit more critically and look at things like web perf. So one of the things that we have been looking at is improving our Lighthouse scores, which is really interesting because I have not been able to find any good information on whether you should use simulated 4G or applied 4G. There's a lot of differing opinions out there on which one you should use for benchmarking. So one of the things that we did as well to justify spending more time doing web perf, because sometimes when you talk to stakeholders or product managers and you talk about web perf, there's a little bit of like, okay, but what is web perf and why should we spend time on that? So the way that we were able to get buy-in and set some sort of benchmarking level was by doing a competitive analysis of similar websites in our space. So once we did that, we gathered a list and we saw kind of where we ranked amongst the competition, and we were actually not the bottom, which is great. It turns out we were a little bit more in the middle top, which is great because we weren't doing awful, but it gave us somewhere to strive. It gave us room for improvement. So that's kind of how we've been working on web perf since. One of the quick things that you can do that we did to try to improve our web performance was a mix of lazy loading and the use of the contentful image API. We use the Vue lazy load plugin, which is great if you need to very quick and dirty set things like progressive loading, or if you need to serve things in next-gen formats. So according to Google, next-gen formats are WebP, JPEG 2000, and JPEG XR. Both of those are deprecated, but it's still showing up on the docs. So, okay, that means that we need to figure out how to serve WebP. And luckily, you can do this very easily using Vue lazy load with just a few lines of config. You can check if the browser supports WebP, and if it does, using the contentful image API, we're able to convert images to WebP on the fly and even compress them down. So here you can see we're requesting format WebP Q equals 35, so that's the quality of the image. So we're compressing it quite a lot. And we achieve that with just query params that you pass to the contentful image API. So this allowed us to just start serving next-gen formats really quickly with a very easy PR that was just a few lines of config. Something similar we did for serving progressive JPEGs and WebP. Again, we're using the progressive filter on Vue lazy load, checking if WebP is supported. We request a very low quality WebP from the Contentful Image API. If not, we request a progressive JPEG, which you can actually also request from the Contentful Image API. One great thing that you get from this is that Contentful provides a CDN built in. So once you convert an image to a specific quality, you're not having to do that work each time you request the image. You actually end up just hitting their CDN. So that's how we were able to achieve success within this project. And one of the many things that we've learned is feature flagging is really cool. And we're actually still using this feature flagging system now for things like A/B testing. So this whole format, way of working, we've really adopted into our day-to-day. So if you have any questions or you would like to talk to us out in the hallway track, we'll be happy to talk to you, or you can also feel free to ask us any questions over Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you.